Well, I always had a room to work in our house at home, so I had what they call the little room in our house, and my father said, well, I suppose to try to keep me under control to some extent, because I was spreading stuff all over the place. So I had a very nice room, it wasn't little at all, it had a beautiful window, a huge window, and I painted there. And one of the interesting things was I went to a sale one day, and there was an absolutely enormous easel coming up from the auction, which I bought for 15 shillings. And it was also accompanied by a gigantic mirror. So I had both these things in my studio. So I had a really good setup from the age of about 14. And with my dog to keep me company, I used to work in there. But it was a good house to make things in. And I could never understand how my friends managed to live in little modern houses, which I rather think my mother would have preferred to live in, because they were neat and tidy. But I just don't know how on earth they managed. There's nowhere to do anything. You know, there's no great cellar like we had. And my brother had a dark room down there, and we had what was the remains of a stable next door. So there was plenty of room, so making things was part of one's life, you know. So one didn't have any problems about somewhere to work. And it made I just got used to that idea very early on in my life. And it's, you know, artists have to have somewhere where they can make a mess, you know, and do things and think things which have to be thought out. And I, of course, later on taught in many art schools, and the same thing comes up again and again. And so that's how I had my first studio, I suppose, was in the house in Woodside Avenue, or Woodside Terrace, I mean.
And what age would that be that you had your delegated space?
That would be, well, that's what we're talking about. I'd be around, if I was 14, it would be 1944. It was during the war. Mm-hmm. And we lived in that house. I was born in 1930, and I lived there with my parents and my brother. And you know, it was a lovely house, and I could think of it as great pleasure. But equally, I was very fond of some various relatives of ours who had a farm up above Laxey called Buldoon, which my mother's family came from. And I used to go up there every summer. I'd be there all summer. And I used to draw and paint up in the barn and so on. So yes, it's always, the island's a very convenient place as far as I'm concerned.
When did you first start drawing? How old were you? Have you always had the urge to draw an art? How soon was it before you knew you wanted to be an artist?
One thing is that I started getting deaf when I was about 3. I had scarlet fever, which in those days was a pretty serious business. You had to go into quarantine and all that sort of thing for about 3 or 4 months. And one of the results of it was it affected my hearing. And gradually, as the years went on, I got less and less hearing. And by the time I was at school, in the Douglas High School, my hearing was pretty awful. So I found it much more sensible to go to the art room. And the people who taught there were very good. They sort of recognized that the best thing to do was to leave me to get all the things in the art room. And so my friend Mr. Chisholm, who was the head of the art room, was a very nice old boy. He was very, you know, supportive and all the rest of it. So, but it did make a tremendous difference, and I didn't begin to get any hearing at all until they started inventing hearing aids. So my first hearing aids I got when I was about, I suppose about 24. And since then, now I have these marvellous new hearing aids which are much better. So hearing is not one of my problems. But it cut out a lot out of my life, particularly music. So, and many other things. But the kids were at school were all right. They were okay. They recognised I might be a bit weird, but you know, I had many friends in high school.
So most of your influences were visual. You at that time.
Well, I suppose I always used to think, well, at least I can draw and paint and stuff, and I'm not dependent on hearing, because you find another way, and that's what one has to do, really. But it's no fun being deaf, because people they don't, there's no visible sign. They just think you're a bit stupid, you know.
Did you see any difference in your artwork once you had the hearing aids? Did it affect how you did things, or was it a slow?
Well, I think it's the nearest thing I can describe. It's a bit like getting a pair of spectacles when you haven't been able to see very well, and so it's the equivalent of that, really. Suddenly you're in contact with the rest of the human race, so it does make a huge difference.
So all the time that you were at the Douglas Art School, you were suffering with deafness.
Art school, yeah.
Yeah. What's your time like there? Did you have studio space there? Did you?
No, we didn't have a studio spaces. I was very fond of the old art school. It's a very nice building, but there was a light room. It was really properly equipped. It had a wonderful collection of casts. I'm still amazed when I think about the old Douglas Art School, which presumably Archie Knox had a lot to do with it. It's a proper building. It's still there, and we had the Discobolus, and we had the statue of Moses by Michelangelo. We had lots of casts, and you felt you were going into a proper artist environment when you went there. And the fact it was run by a rather strange character called Mr. Whitehead was rather one of the things you just rather put up with. But you were in a place, and the other interesting thing about that Douglas Art School was that they managed to get very good loans of stuff from the Arts Council, or the equivalent of the Arts Council. And it was amazing the stuff that used to turn up, you know, things by Stanley Spencer and famous artists like Graham Sutherland. I mean, really, really amazing stuff, and they were hanging around in the little art school. So we weren't entirely dependent on looking at the work of J.M. Nicholson and William Hoggart, which was the main thing in the... Not that there's anything wrong with those two, but it was a bit limiting, you know.
A bit insular. You felt it could have been a bit insular then.
Yeah,
so they appreciated that, so they were bringing outside influences.
I don't know where they used to get those things from, but it must have been like some sort of circulating collection run by the Arts Council. There wouldn't be an Arts Council then, but maybe it's something to do with the British government, I don't know.
What was the structure of the art school? How did it work?
The art school in Douglas?
Yeah.
Well, it was dominated by the head, Mr. Whitehead, and he was, he'd been quite a successful mural painter in Manchester, and he had a very high opinion of himself, and thought of himself as being a man of many talents, and a musician, a mural painter and a sculptor, and he was surprisingly competent, but he was not at all good at communicating his talents to the students. And my favourite memory of him was I'd done clay head, and I came in the next morning and I noticed it was all squashed. So he came up to me and he said, "So you've noticed?" And I said, "Oh yes, somebody must have knocked it over." And he said, "I thought you were getting a bit too cocky, so I gave it a thump." So there's Mr. Whitehead, teaching method for you.
Kind of sums it up. Who were your contemporaries at the school there? Who were your contemporaries at the school there? Who were your fellow students?
Oh, sorry.
And were there any fellow students that stick out while you were there?
No fellow students. Well, there were a few. There was a very nice chap called Edward Kneale, who eventually became a very successful watercolour painter. I think he became head of the Watercolour Society of Marine Artists. A very nice bloke, and a very, very, very talented girl called Joan Kennish, who is still, I'm glad to say, going strong in Ramsey, though she's not been well for quite a long time. And she had the real thing, but she had to give up her going to art school because her family needed her to help on the farm. And she did, and she's still with us, thank goodness. But she had a real natural talent, which is fairly rare, you know.
What genre was she? What genre did she?
Just for drawing and painting. She really had the proper stuff, which is even Whitehead recognised it.
So he didn't scribble on it overnight, saying she was getting too far.
I think she became a poet as well, actually.
Right.
And I'm sure she was very good at poetry as well. Yeah, and so apart from that, there were a few other people, but it wasn't a proper art school in a way, because there was no real system. It was just vaguely about sort of learning a few skills. And I found I managed much better when I was at home in my own studio, where I could just get on with things and read books about art and all that sort of thing. So there was no library in the art school, and we had a few part-time teachers and so on. And of course, in the end, years and years later, my friend Norman Sale, who had worked for Whitehead, took over the school, and I think he put in quite an adventurous program. But I never really discussed it with him.
But the reputation was there for Norman's when he had his time there. When his time was there, the reputation was very good at the art school. Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure he was a very good influence, because he was very talented. I knew him at school, of course, and he was before he was called up. He was a very good painter, and in the end, of course, he triumphed with his watercolours, and he really was very good. He liked to be told he was good too.
He was quite a character, wasn't he? Yeah. So immediately after the school, where did you go? Did you move to England then? When you were 17, did you move on?
I went to the Royal Academy Schools, and I was there with Sheila Girling was one of our fellow students. She was married later to Tony Caro, and Tony was there as well. And anyway, when we went there, we were probationers, and you know, you had to go into the life room and draw every day, all day and every day. And we all got quite good at drawing life models and so on. But there was very little discussion about why on earth we should be doing it in the first place. But a friend of mine, or I think he was a friend, persuaded me when I finished my probationership to have a go at the Rome Prize, because he was obsessed with winning the Rome Prize, and which was 2 years in Rome, and it was his point of his existence to do these things for the Rome Prize. There was sort of lots, you had to do architectural drawing and anatomical drawing, and mural painting, mural drawing, and God knows what. There's quite a lot involved, portrait painting. Anyway, cut a long story short, about halfway through I got fed up with doing all this stuff and dreaded the amount of stuff which I still had to do. So I decided not to do it. I withdrew, and anyway, I was persuaded by this crony of mine to go on, because he said he wouldn't win the Rome Prize unless I kept his nose to the grindstone. And the upshot was that I won the Rome Prize and he didn't. And he was extremely cross and bashed me over the head with his paint box in the middle of Piccadilly Circus. And it burst and the paint went all over the road and the buses went over, there was colour everywhere. It was great. I never saw him again.
Didn't take it well.
So I found myself in Rome, and that was the sum total of my art education, which is very, very little. So.
Where was the most influence for your art education, would you say? Would it be, I'm saying, where was the biggest influence? From the Isle of Man College or from the academy? Where was your biggest influence, would you say, educationally? Would it be from Douglas or would it be from the academy?
Well, I suppose wandering around Italy was really the main thing. And it was very different in those days because there were no tourists. It was just after the war, and you could go into the Uffizi and there's nobody there. It's unbelievable now. But yes, and I had a few friends in Rome. There were only about 4 of us, so it was a bit incestuous, but you had to make your mind up and get on with things. So I had a lovely studio, and of course it was warm and wonderful.
How did you fund yourself in Italy?
Well, we had a grant to win the Rome Prize. Of course, that was the point. You had enough to keep going, but there was very little to spare because you had to pay for everything. You had to pay for your food, for your heating, and of course there was not much left over for travelling and buying materials and things like that. So well, it was far from being well off or anything. And if you wanted a model, you had to pay for that yourself. So it was fairly tough.
Was it a shared studio? Did you share the studio? Or did
no, we
you had your
our own studio. They were very, very nice studios, great big places, huge high ceiling. And you slept in the studio on a thing called a palliasse, which is a bag of straw. And it was okay, except that so many other people had slept on the same bag of straw. It had formed, it was like a sort of strange dent in it. You had to fit into the dent.
Did you ever do any paintings for sale to keep, any bread and butter paintings to help the finances while you were there? Was there any of that?
I did paint them, but we didn't sell anything.
No.
In fact, Rome, that place had very few private galleries. Very, very few. There were 1 or 2, but nothing. But I just managed somehow or other,
Mm-hmm.
and travelled as much as I could.
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't got any transport, so I went everywhere by bus. But of course the main thing was getting around the galleries, going to Siena, going to Arezzo to have a look at the Pierrots, getting out of Naples and see everything I could see.
Who's been the biggest influence on you, Bryan?
Well, I suppose one of the disappointments was, though the British School is next to the Gallery of Modern Art, it hadn't got any modern art. There was hardly anything. I'd imagine it would be full of all sorts of wonderful modern Italian artists like Chirico and so on. There weren't. They were mostly Victorian painters. And I don't know what it's like now, but it was a waste of time as far as I'm concerned. They had a Boccioni, and I think they had a small Severini, but I got to know one or 2 of the artists in Rome. But one of the problems in a way was because it was easy, we could all speak English to each other, and none of us learned Italian. Whereas my friend Sandra Blow, sadly left dead now, she went out on a scholarship about 4 years before me, just when the war was ending, and she became the mistress of one of the best-known Italian artists. So she got to know everybody. She was an extremely attractive girl, and she became quite a sort of had a wonderful time, and she learned to speak Italian, and she knew Guttuso, she knew everybody, and I think she was mixed up with Buri actually, and there was a making of her because she was exposed to some of the best painters and sculptors, and instead of living in that rather ship alongside we were in.
How long were you there, man? How long were you there, Bryan? How long were you there?
I was there for 2 years.
2 years.
Yeah. But I missed the island terribly actually, funnily enough. But I used to dream of the, it was so hot in Rome, especially in the summer. I used to dream of going back to the Baldwin Valley and the glens,
Were you finding the island was still influencing your work even though you were there in that climate, or do you think you were engrossed in Italian art? I was saying, did the Manx influences come out in your work still there, or do you think they were put aside at that time to learn?
I think so. I was very much thinking about the island, yes. And yes, the thing about the island, man, you can't shake it off at all. Impossible. It's there every day with me and always will be. And I think if you want a real influence on my work and my life, it's been the fact that I come from that little island in the middle of the sea. So yes, that's what I'm about to some extent.
Yeah. Where did you go after Rome? Where was it?
Rome. Well, I went back to the Catholic school actually, for about a year. And then one day I just painted something. It was actually based on, I'd been up in a hill village not far from Rome. And it was, of course, the whole place had been, they really had a terrible war. And a lot of the people had been, wounded and damaged and so on. And I was in this village, and I saw a chap there, and I think he had his legs blown off, and he was managing somehow with his hand on a pair of tiny stools, which he was using as a walking aid. And I've seen the same thing. If you look in medieval paintings, you find this is the sort of thing that crops up in a Bruegel or a Hieronymus Bosch. Anyway, I did a painting of him from drawings I'd done in Italy at the Royal Academy. And I was extremely pleased with it. I thought I'd really got somewhere at long last. And then I went into one of the galleries. There were very few galleries in London at that time. And this was the Redfern Gallery, just opposite the Academy. And I was being extremely rude about the exhibition. And the director came up and he said rather nastily, "I suppose you think you can do better." And I said, "Of course I can," because I was very arrogant in some ways. And I showed him the painting, and I said, "Have a look at that." And he said, "Yes, it's rather good." He said, "Have you got, say, a lot of these?" And I said, "Oh, well, yes, in a way." And in fact, I thought, well, maybe one day. Anyway, he said, "If you show me about a dozen of them, we might think about possibly showing you." So I went off with my head in the air, and I worked like a maniac for 2 years to produce these 12, 15 paintings. And 2 years later I went back, and I could not go through the door. I think I'm crazy. I've been working on this thing, assuming that I would have a show. I'm completely mad. I can't go through the door. So I rang my brother up and I told him what was happening. And he was very cross because he was busy writing the Quatermass things at the time. And he said, "Don't pester me with this, go through the door, I'm a stupid idiot." So anyway, I went in, and of course they'd completely forgotten me. And however, when I showed them their painting that they'd seen in the first place, they said, "Oh yes, we wondered what had happened to you." And they gave me a show, and that's how I got going. And then, but to do those paintings, of course, I had to have a studio. And luckily, one of my fellow students was a nice Austrian girl, was going back to Austria to study mosaic. And so she said, well, she wanted to leave the studio, and she rented it to me, I think 12 shillings a week. And it was a lovely little studio, and I was able to work in peace. I had really no money, of course, so I had to, my father kept me going, and he just gave me enough to manage by, because they hadn't got much money themselves, of course. So he kept me going, and I was able to produce the paintings. So I owe it enormously to his help. Without that, it would have been impossible. Absolutely impossible.
And was the show a success? You said it got you going. Was it a great success?
So that was my first exhibition.
How many did you sell of your 12?
I actually sold quite a lot of stuff at that show. And yeah, it was a successful show, so the gallery wanted me to keep showing with them. And I had many exhibitions with them until, I suppose, about 10 years later, I found my work changing so much. I got into a feeling that I had to make some really radical shift in my work. And what happened was I started to make sculpture. And I had no training as a sculptor and no interest in modeling at all. And so I asked my brother-in-law, who was a farmer, would he show me how to stick 2 bits of metal together? And he did, and so I became a sculptor, because he taught me to weld and to use all the techniques he did as a farmer engineer, and that's what I became, a sculptor.
Did you have any sculptor influences? Did you manage to get anyone to help you with the technique, or did you work your own techniques or your own?
I didn't. It was very funny. There were no, at that time, people didn't teach metal sculpture in art schools at all. It didn't happen. Nearly all the art schools had sculpture schools that were about stone carving and modelling. To actually work directly in metal was, it simply didn't happen. It didn't happen until years later. In fact, that's how I began teaching at the Royal College, because the students themselves used to come to my studio to learn from me how to do it. And eventually I said to the Professor of Sculpture at the Royal College of Art, I can't see why they don't work. And why don't you let them teach them how? And he said, well, I'll come down to your studio and see what's going on. So he came down and he said, well, I see what you mean, so you better come to the Royal College. And that's so I began teaching at the Royal College of Art. And so the connection was made there. And many of the other sculptors earlier sculptors who had been working directly in metal, like Ridge Butler and Lynn Chadwick, came through their experience as engineers, and so for that matter, Tony Caro. And but I was very much a self-taught sculptor, and that's the way it's been right through.
Right.
Still trying to teach myself.
So in your time at the Royal College, how did your students manage to create their works? Did they have studio space with welding equipment, or how did it work for them?
Well, the old sculpture school of the Royal College of Art consisted of a collection of ancient army huts which had been around since the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, I believe Rodin had actually taught there. He certainly knew about it, and he had a tremendous amount of connection with people who ran it. And of course, anyway, by the time I had to do with the Royal College, it consisted of, it was a large wooden building covered with corrugated iron, very good light, and a beautiful place to work in. We had a foundry, but there was the professor of sculpture, who was called Bernard Meadows, who wasn't the least bit interested in machines and that sort of thing, until I arrived. And I said, we must change all this, and I persuaded him to invest in some machinery, like band saws, circular saws, and general workshop welding equipment. And at first he was against it. He said, well, I don't know why you insist on lumbering us for this stuff, because they'll never be able to afford this stuff when they leave here. It'll be beyond their pockets. But he was very interested in bronze casting, mainly because we used to cast his work as well. So he had set up a course in teaching students to learn how to cast in bronze, which was run by a very nice Italian founderman called Angeloni. Anyhow, he succumbed to my persuasion after a bit, and in no time he had quite a taste for using the machines himself. And so he sort of never looked back after that. So eventually we got properly equipped for the workshops and everything.
So did the students have their own Pacific area, or did they work generally in the large studios?
No, well, that was the great virtue of the place, was it had a lot of room. They were very big studios, and we tried to give them as much space as possible, and most of them had a very big area, something like 30 feet by, say, 25 or 30 by 20, very big, and completely wooden building, apart from one particular studio which had a concrete floor. So they were able to do absolutely anything there, including if they wanted to saw into the floor of the building or go through the walls, they would do so. And we also said, oh well, we can always stick it back again. So many of the young students we had there came out with a sort of tremendous feeling that the buildings weren't a prison, they were a huge workshop they could do anything with. And of course a lot of extremely good sculptors emerged from the Royal College building. Nigel Hall, Tony Cragg, I could remember, so many of them I can't be bothered to talk about how many others were.
Do you think that the interaction that they had in that studio space was helpful to them rather than being in isolation? A lot of the time you seem to have been in almost isolation while you were working. What do you think of, what would you prefer?
Well, as a matter of fact, I always liked having people around, and when I actually began to worked in metal. As I said, my brother-in-law gave me some, well, he showed me how to weld and so on and so forth. And I managed to persuade my gallery to finance me with at least to find a place to work in. Because obviously I couldn't weld in the middle of my flat and so on, a young wife and a young baby. So I eventually found a space which is a basement flat in Chiswick, and they let me have a room in their cellar, and it's quite amusing when I come to think of it, because they were very, very keen CND supporters, and the cellar was absolutely full of flags and banners and so on. And there would I be welding away, and sometimes on my way home I would think, oh God, did I make sure there was not a spark adrift in my studio? And I would turn the car around and drive all the way back to Turnham Green, just to make quite sure that I hadn't left something burning, which is probably just as well actually, though I never did find anything. Though plenty of accidents can happen, and we had plenty of those at the Royal College, I can tell you.
Was health and safety a priority there?
Yes, yes, because you know, when you're working in sculpture, you do use a lot of dangerous materials, and you need a place where it's safe to work. And if you do have a proper studio, you know, it's got to be a safe studio as well. But you know, you just have to keep an eye on things.
You know, when you were saying about your students being able to be allowed to alter the studio space to accommodate their works, has the studio spaces has it ever affected your production of a piece or influenced the size or the scale of your pieces? Does the size of your working environment, does it have a big impact, or do you find the space after you've decided on the scale?
Oh,
how does it work?
Oh yes, well, making sculpture, as far as I'm concerned, is a noisy, certainly the way I work, but it depends on the sculptor, it depends on what you're trying to do. Some sculptors like to have a completely clean space where they can think, or they make their work and so on. But the main thing is you have a place which is your world. You create a world of your own there, and it has to be suitable for what you're trying to do. But also the interaction with other artists is very important. I mean, when I moved from, I mentioned my basement studio, which I managed to make my first exhibition, fairly small work, but I finished with that one. I realized my ambitions were that I had to get somewhere where I could work, forge steel, really attack it and make things with it. And I happened to be buying a bit of metal in an ironmonger's, and in Fulham actually, and the chap who was selling the workman, the bits of metal to me, said, what do you want to do with it? What is it for? So I explained that I was making sculpture, and I really wanted to forge like a blacksmith. And he said, well, we've got a foundry next door that's been empty for 20 years. Would that be any use to you? So I went in, and there was a complete, wonderful blacksmith's forge, set up, forge, bellows, all a 19th century forge and blacksmith's outfit. Anyway, I jumped at it, and I took it, and it was it was part of a bigger building. So I took the lot. It was very inexpensive and I could afford it. So I then moved some of my friends into the other bits, and we had upstairs was what had been a sign painter's studio, which is absolutely ideal for a painter. And so I had a couple of my friends up there, and another chap who was also working in a similar sort of way. So we formed a little group of 4 or 5 of us, and it's great. It's very good when you are sharing space with other artists, because you know, you go up and down. Sometimes you have a good day, sometimes you have a bad day. And I had a wonderful friend called Henry Inlander, who's no longer with us, I'm afraid. And he used to, he would ricochet from the depths of despair to the heights of achievement within a single morning. Sometimes I used to stand there working at my bench, and I could see reflected in the back of my goggles my friend Heinz standing behind me, and he would say, "I'm a genius." And I said, "Oh, are you really?" He said, "Just come and have a look at this." So I would pop upstairs, see what he was up to. And equally in the turn, I remember somebody coming down, "You can't exhibit that, it's totally obscene." So I said, "Well, I'll have to give it an obscene title then, won't I?" And I won't tell you what it was, but it worked very well, and I believe it was bought by the Contemporary Art Society. So looking there was another story.
Did you value the other artist's opinion? Did you value the other artist's opinion? Did you seek their opinion about your work, or if you were unsure of something, would you run it past people, or
No,
do you think you?
We never really talked directly about it. You know, it's rather odd. You do need the support. All you need is somebody to say, "It's wonderful, it's marvellous." That's all you need. Somebody coming along and say, "Well, I don't like it, that's up too much," is not helpful. One needs encouragement. But you can have discussions on the nature, why you're doing it in the first place, and what's going on in the art world, because it's a network of people going. Some people will have been to an exhibition, others won't. So it's constantly, everyone is very excited about if they've seen a really good show, they want to talk about it, and lots of ideas are passed on through that. And I know the Royal College was particularly good like that. The students became, well, you could see how they drew from each other a lot of idea, a lot of contact. Yeah, I think it is important. You just tell which art school people have been to, whether they've really got something out of it, established their career for them. Other art schools, maybe not so successful. And of course I found one of the most useful things in my own case, and this is really talking about myself as someone teaching at the Royal College. After all, I taught there part-time mostly for many, many years. I also used to go around the art schools all over the country, having a look at the degree shows and actually deciding on the qualifications they would get from that. So I got to know the whole nature of the art teaching business in England and in Scotland and in Southern Ireland and in Northern Ireland as well. So I was very much part of the whole thing, and to some extent I was also on quite a few committees which were deciding how the art schools and the art world should be created. So yes, I got a lot to do with artists and their studios and the art schools I went to. I never had anything to do with art schools on the continent at all, so I can't really say I know quite how it works in France. Though I did have one student, and an old friend of mine now, who taught in the Champs-Élysées, who taught in the Beaux-Arts in Paris, and he laid down a sort of list of things he wanted if he was going to work there. They'd given him a sort of, I think he was going to work for about 3 months in the Beaux-Arts. And anyway, when he got there, they had not done anything. He had no equipment, nothing. And he was extremely angry. So he said, what I'm going to do is we're going to go out and buy a set of chainsaws, and we're going to cut down all the trees in the Champs-Élysées. And within minutes, all the equipment he wanted was being poured through the door. So that's the way you have to handle these things.
How long were you at Fulham? How long were you at the foundry at Fulham?
I was there for 10 years. And then I moved from there to a railway arch in Putney. And the railway arch was, I was on my own, and I missed the company of the other artists, but it was quite good. It was a big space, and by that time my work had moved completely away from forging metal as a blacksmith would. I was working much more as an engineer, sculptor, and I had become irresistibly obsessed with machinery. And I had a huge lathe, and which I bought. And I managed to get hold of a chap who was actually, I believe, friends of the Beatles. He was an ex-boxer, and he helped me enormously because he had some training in engineering, and he showed me how to use machines for it and how to use the equipment. It's absolutely essential to have somebody who really knows what they're doing.
And did that change the nature of your work,
Yes.
having those production?
I began to work very much with machines and lathes. I had a very big lathe, milling machines, things like that. And so that was the next stage, really.
And then where were you after the?
Yeah.
Where were you after the arches? Where did you go after the arches?
After the arch, well, it became rather difficult there because my wife had become terribly disabled with multiple sclerosis, and so we had to move to a more suitable house up in Muswell Hill, where I live to this day. And so for a bit I didn't have a studio at all, and then I built this one at the bottom of the garden, which had been a sort of garage. So I had it rebuilt, largely with the proceeds of being knocked down by a speeding police car and had my leg broken very badly. So after 3.5 months in hospital, I was given a certain amount of compensation, and that's what I spent the money on, to building my studio here, which you see around me now.
Yeah, it seems a wonderful place. It's beautiful, and so near for you at the bottom of the garden.
But equally, I was looking for someone where I could do some bigger stuff and more suitable for metalworking. And eventually I found that something called the Haringey Arts Council had taken over an old
Chocolate
sort of
factory.
place where they made a chocolate factory. In fact, I believe they made licorice all sorts, but it had been gradually turned into sort of sweatshops and so on. And the Arts Council had managed to persuade the council to turn it into studios, and that is now the chocolate factory, and that's where my big studio is, which again is all full of machinery and things like that, where I was able to work. But the chocolate factory has about 300 different artists working there, I believe, and it mostly consists of fairly small studios, which would be quite adequate for most painters. And there are also equipment for photography and woodworking and so on. But there are several of these chocolate factory-like setups in London. But of course I also got myself involved with the whole business of getting artists' studios together, because and this goes back quite a long time now, when I still had the place in Fulham. And what happened there was some friends of mine, mainly Bridget Riley and various other friends, a very nice man called Tony West, and who else was Bert Irving, and Michael Kenny and several other artists. I had decided to set up a sort of a thing called Air and Space. They persuaded Henry Moore to give them a sort of an overdraft, so they could take on buildings which had been left derelict in the dockland, because at that time most of dockland had become empty because the docks were no longer used, and that whole area was full of incredible spaces. And I remember we had one of the first ones we had was St. Catherine's Dock, which was a huge, great thing called the Ivory Warehouse. Now it's hotels and very, very expensive flats and things. But when we were there, we took this place over on the condition that if the owners ever wanted the place back, we would get out, and in the meantime pay a fairly minuscule rent. So that's what we did. And
do you find these sort of industrial buildings, you know, you've heard that we're changing the Market Hall at Douglas into studios for the students up at the college. What's your feeling on that building being used?
Well, it's a long time since I've been in the building. In fact, I have sort of dim recollections of it being a place where they sold Manx butter and stuff like that. And I would have to go and have another look, but I do remember it, but I can't really remember how big it is. I think it is quite large, actually, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But I really would have to look at the measurements, and I wonder what the light is like.
Yeah, it has quite a lot of skylights around the top. It's very square, and I believe there's still a butcher's in there at the moment, but I believe he's leaving.
Any idea what the actual floor measurement would be?
I don't, I'm sorry, no, I don't know.
But I think it would be fine, actually, because if you've got enough space, you can do anything with it. Mm-hmm. And I mean, when we took out St. Catherine's Dock, it was just a huge empty space full of dead pigeons and dead rats and droppings everywhere. It was a horrible mess. But we cleared it out, painted it, and turned it into studios, and everyone soon got to work making things, and all sorts of other studios were taken as old buildings. We had everything from old dairies to, you know.
Were any of these open to the public? Were any of these open to the public? The Market Hall is going to be open to the public. I'm wondering, what's your views on that?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think it's best to have open days, because you can have open days when people come in, but I wouldn't have it do like some sort of zoo or something, because you've got a lot of time you have to spend as an artist. It's just thinking, drawing, making mistakes, getting fed up, spending a whole day without achieving absolutely anything at all. And you really won't get much of it. You have to explain what you were up to on a bad day. A good day is all right, but I think it's better to have, as we do in, what we do in the chocolate factory is that once a year, the whole place is open to the public for a weekend, and literally thousands of people come down. But sadly enough, I can't let them into my studio because it's too dangerous. There's equipment there which is not suitable for children to be anywhere near. Also, it's full of rather nasty chemicals and things like that. But for the most part, it's very popular. People come to it and they buy work, of course, and it's a very successful business. We also have a restaurant down there, so I would like to have shown it to, but perhaps another time.
That would be lovely. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Bryan. I do appreciate it. Thank you.